It's hard to be a lead pastor. I was a lead pastor. It's hard. You know, somebody just yesterday said to me, a pastoral figure was just criticized right before the worship service started. Pastor. He said, "Is this the way it goes?" He was young. "Is this normal that two people walk up to me right before my sermon and criticize the way I'm leading the church?" I said, "It's kind of normal, yeah. It's pretty close to normal. I mean, within a 3-minute time frame, somebody's probably going to tell you something that made them unhappy because there you are." And how about this? If you're a surgeon, if you're working on tiny little spaces in the spinal column or behind somebody's eye or in their nose, back in the sinuses, and you nick a nerve, you hurt them permanently, and it's nerve-wracking. Wouldn't it be easier just to be a pediatrician and write prescriptions or not for kids who have a cold? It would be so much easier.
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Our guest today is Dan Doriani. Dan is professor of biblical and systematic theology at Covenant Seminary. He earned an MA at Yale University and an MDiv and PhD at Westminster Seminary. Dan has pastored several churches and has served in administrative roles at Covenant Seminary in addition to his work there as a teacher and scholar. And since 2022, Dan has served on the executive board of the Gospel Coalition. Dan is a popular speaker at conferences and other venues and has authored or co-authored 20 books, which include biblical commentaries, works on gender roles, and books that explore a biblical view of work, which is what we'll discuss today. Dan has two excellent treatments of this topic, one entitled Work, Its Purpose, Dignity, and Transformation, and another entitled Work That Makes a Difference, both with P&R Press. In conjunction with these publications, Dan launched the Center for Faith and Work in St. Louis. He hosts the podcast Working with Dan Doriani, which features interviews with people whose work has been especially impactful. You can find a link to that podcast on our episode summary. So, Dan Doriani, welcome to the Kalos Center podcast.
Well, it's good to be here, Jim. Nice to chat with you again.
It's my pleasure to work with you today by talking about the work you do on work.
Yeah. Yes. Working on work. Right. I like it.
So I suppose the most logical place to begin would be with a definition. How would you define work, or how should we all understand work in terms of how it's defined and what is its origin?
Yeah. So a good definition, not mine, is work is concentrated effort that includes a willingness to overcome obstacles to accomplish something of significance. Now, what that is intended to do is distinguish from play, where you don't really care, what happens when you're squirting each other with guns. And it also intends to differentiate between the subcategory of employment or a job and work. So we want to make sure we understand that someone who's taking care of children hour by hour, not just 5 minutes, but taking care of them for years and long periods of time, is working. That cooking for health is work. For good meals is work, whether it happens in a restaurant or at home. Washing dishes and, making beds and so forth, which you could get paid for or not. It's work either way when you overcome obstacles. It also covers people who volunteer at anything in a sustained and weighty, concentrated manner. Key issue is you overcome obstacles. If you quit the minute an obstacle comes up, you're not really working. You're just fooling around with something or dabbling in something. And the origin, of course, is what you and I agree, Jim, is that God ordained work for humanity from the beginning. And that comes from the fact that God is a worker, presents himself as a worker, gives himself, you've seen the list, but I just jotted one down a minute ago. In the Bible, he calls himself a king. That's a job. Teacher, shepherd, architect, judge, prophet, also a job. Carpenter, warrior, creator, farmer, designer, potter, priest. Those are just a few of them. So God's a worker, and therefore he wants us to work because he made us in his image.
Interesting that the concept of overcoming obstacles is central to that definition of work when we so often associate obstacles with the fall and the kind of
Yeah.
resistance that is ubiquitous in all of human experience in a fallen world. But God ordained work for human beings before the fall. So,
Right.
what's the significance of that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for pointing out. We agree that work is not simply a curse, right? It's not something to be avoided as much as possible, foisted on machines or animals or slaves in ages past. In fact, there's still slaves, of course, all all over the world today in the millions, sadly. But work did exist before the curse, and I think it did include obstacles. I mean, if you look at what God put in the world, things like silicon. Silicon does not become a semiconductor by snapping our fingers. And there's no reason to believe there would not have been toil in developing technology, for example, or putting up buildings of size or creating instruments for rapid transit. There's no reason to believe that's a result of the fall, right? Big world, people start connecting, people might want to travel, that would take work. And there wouldn't be people dropping things on their fingers and smashing their hands and getting injured and getting angry at each other. But I certainly think foresight, labor, extraction of minerals and making them formable and then formed to create what we want to use to promote human flourishing.
So,
In other words, we're not anti-technology. We're
Mhm.
not anti-cultural development.
So is the key difference there between work prior to and post fall, the whole working by the sweat of your brow business?
Mhm. Yeah, sweat of the brow. It's interesting. We don't really know. Would it have been 72 degrees and balmy at all points forever and ever on Earth? Or, we've enjoyed, there's a good chance we would have enjoyed a little heat. We might have perspired a bit. But it wouldn't
Mm.
have been miserable sweat. There's good sweat and bad sweat. And there's, uh, there's this sweat that comes because, you're failing. Flop sweats, we call them. And there wouldn't have been
Mm.
flop sweats, I don't think, without the fall. But, there might have been some good perspiration, right? I mean, it's good to run hard. When we run hard, we perspire. So, sweat of your brow, I think we shouldn't just take literally, but we should take, in the metaphorical sense, it's miserable sweat, I think is what,
Mm.
we're supposed to understand from Genesis chapter 3.
And there is that concept that, the Apostle Paul mentions, or it's a statement he makes about, um, the world in its present form being in
Right.
bondage to decay,
Yeah.
which it would be tell me what you think of this. I mean, it's very easy to associate that with this, principle of
Right.
second law of thermodynamics, which says that entropy increases, right? That any closed system, it tends towards disorder. I wonder
Right.
if that's part of the curse, and there are different views on that.
Yeah, I don't of course, I'm not a physicist, nor am I a theoretical physicist, so all I can say is it's a great question. I do recall a conversation with perhaps one of the most thoughtful architects I've ever known, who said, "I'm going to ask God when I meet him why he made water so that it causes wood to decay, because so many problems as an architect come from the decay of wood through moisture." Why did he make the world that way? I don't know. And was it always that way? So these are hypotheticals, right?
Mm.
Um, so I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm gonna confess my ignorance.
Yeah, water. Water like fire, it's our best friend and our worst enemy, right?
Yeah, right, right.
So some people say that all work, or at least all morally legitimate work, is equal. Do you think there's any truth to that idea, that it's all equal in value? And if that isn't right, then why is it problematic?
Yeah, so first of all, a few people, thank you for your, careful formulation of the question. You and I agree that all work is not equal. There's work that's destructive. And, for example, if you're promoting addictive video games for 3-year-olds, that's not good work. It's legal. We want to distinguish between what's legal and what's moral.
Mhm.
Obviously, anything that's addictive, anything that's destructive is illegitimate. So, is all morally legitimate, as God defines moral, legitimate, equal? And the answer is yes in some ways and no in some ways. So, in some ways, yes, because if someone digs a ditch or shovels snow, which I was just doing 20 minutes ago, uh, that's good work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with shoveling snow or raking leaves. And if I have snow on my driveway or my sidewalk, and if I have leaves in my yard that are choking out some plants that I like, then I should remove them. The question is, could God be pleased with that? Well, certainly, if my attitude is good, I'm doing it to please my wife, please my neighbors, beautify my property, or take care of my property so nobody falls, that's all good. The person who washes dishes, scrubs floors, scrubs pots, all those people are doing good work, especially, of course, as they do it honestly and they work hard and they do it unto the Lord. It's all equal. But it's also true that work is unequal because some work has more strategic heft or significance than other work. And I'll say that's obvious. I mean, the person who's scrubbing floors at a major corporation has far less ability to promote the good that that corporation seeks than the CEO or the people in the corporate executive suite. So they can please God equally, but one person has more leverage to do good in the world. In that sense, it's there's, I don't know if let's just say better, but it's of greater value to the world at large. And then, of course, if you hone your skills, and maybe I'm not just shoveling snow, but I'm the best snow shoveler around, and I'm teaching other people how to shovel snow really well so that streets are safe, then that's worth a little bit more than somebody who's reckless or heedless about the way they shovel snow or do anything else. But then the real question is, what do you do teach at gifts you don't really like having, or you're able to do some things that are very arduous? So, Jim, you pointed out, I've been a pastor about 16 years or more, 16 years in large churches, and then about 5 years in small churches besides being a prof. And it's hard to be a lead pastor. I was a lead pastor. It's hard. Somebody just yesterday said to me, because they were criticized, a pastoral figure was just criticized right before the worship service started. Pastor. He said, "Is this the way it goes?" He was young. "Is this normal that two people walk up to me right before my sermon and criticize the way I'm leading the church?" I said, "It's kind of normal, yeah. It's pretty close to normal. I mean, within a 3-minute time frame, somebody's probably going to tell you something that made them unhappy because there you are. And wouldn't it be easier to be, I don't know, a truck driver? People don't go around criticizing truck drivers right before they get in the truck. And how about this? If you're a surgeon, if you're working on tiny little spaces in the spinal column or behind somebody's eye or in their nose, back in the sinuses, and you nick a nerve, you hurt them permanently, and it's nerve-wracking. Wouldn't it be easier just to be a pediatrician and write prescriptions or not for kids who have a cold? It would be so much easier. But the Bible says that those to whom much is given, much is required. And we have to take that with utmost seriousness. If you have had training, if you have innate gifts, plus training, formal training, plus mentors, informal training, plus friends, more informal training, you've probably acquired substantial skills. And if you have those, by God's grace, you are not only called upon as a good steward to use those gifts, but you're actually be called to account. One of my favorite passages on this is Luke chapter 12, verse 20 and 48 both say this, but 12:48 is what I was quoting. To whom much is given, much will be required. But then 12:20 talks about that rich farmer, you know him, and at the end of his life, he stored up all this wealth. And at the end, God says, "Whose will they be?" And the answer is not yours, but you'll be called to an account. I'm just going to quote the verse in the ESV for a second. But God said to him, "Fool, this very night your life will be required of you." Now that word required means called to account. What did you do with what I gave you? You just heaped it up for yourself. You're going to have to give an account for that. I gave you much, and you spent it selfishly. And then Jesus says later on, so learn the lesson. You've been given much, use much. And we do please more. It's a long answer. We please more when we make the most use of the gifts, opportunities, skills, training, mentoring that we've received.
Yeah.
So in that sense, all work is not equal. I'll say it just one different way. I loved unloading trucks when I was 20, 21 years old. My first job after college, unloaded trucks for a few months. Loved it. Simple, clean, start 3 hours later, truck's empty, everything's put away. Great. Sometimes they're really long for that, but I think it would be a sin for me to unload trucks once I got my PhD, no matter how much easier it would have been.
It's interesting how every line of work has its own unique stresses. Some like that, the stresses are more physical, and
Mhm.
sometimes they're more psychological, sometimes they're more relational.
Yep.
And depending on how public the work is, maybe the stresses have to do with the criticism and how, your public platform really, yeah, eh, if it doesn't invite the criticism, in any case, it certainly occasions more of it. You've
Yep.
probably known, as I have, some coaches, at D1 schools who are very high
Okay.
profile, and, what might have appeared to be a kind of, whoa, cushy multi-million-dollar job, where you're doing nothing but, you know, um, helping young people play this game you love, what could be more fun than that? Then you realize, whoa, not so fast. That is not a job I want. And I think maybe they're earning their multi-million a year paycheck.
At least they deserve to be paid well.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure I love the idea that, the best elementary school teacher in the world gets
Mm,
as much in 10 years as they get in 10 days, more or less, or at
yes.
least the high-end athletes. But they work very hard, and they have high skills, and they bear a heavy burden, no doubt.
Yeah, the counter to what I just kinda casually mentioned is, that they deserve it, is that, well, let's look at the intrinsic value of what is being provided to society by, let's say, an NBA basketball player. You have
Mm,
someone, and this is different than being a coach, where if you're if you're a good coach at whatever level, you're doing character formation. But let's just talk about the players and the superstars in, say, NBA basketball. What are they doing? They are repeatedly putting a rubber sphere through a metal ring. I mean, that
yeah,
that is literally what they're doing, and they may be getting paid 10, 20 million dollars a year to repeatedly put a rubber ball through a sphere, and if, they're good defensively, they stop other people from putting, yeah, rubber balls through their ring. And so, compare the intrinsic value of that to, say, a first grade teacher, my first
mhm,
grade teacher, Mrs. Rogers at Harlan Elementary School in Birmingham, Michigan. She taught me to read. And you, there's someone who taught you
yeah,
to read, Dan, and that's just your life. Think how transformed our lives have been. And then you multiply that out. Say somebody teaches first graders for 30 years, they're teaching thousands of kids to read, and how that ramifies out in their life in terms of their service to society. There's no comparison. And yet they're making tens of thousands a year rather than millions. One could
yeah,
argue that's inherently unjust.
yeah. Well, you're saying you don't like the market system.
And then that's the problem. Is there a better system than capitalism? And that's a whole other debate.
So
But
let me just have fun with this for a second. Of course, I believe that teaching is extremely valuable and should be valued. The question of the marketplace, I mean, even, I don't know, not all that, but 30 years ago, $1 million salary was extraordinarily high. And now 40 million is almost routine in certain sports. How can this happen? Of course, the answer is what they're actually doing is not simply putting a ball through a sphere. It's putting a ball through a sphere despite very talented people trying to prevent them from doing that, with hours and hours and hours of training at evading those who would try to prevent them from putting it in the sphere in order to sell products, in order to
mm,
market products. That's what they're really doing. They're putting on something that's construed as entertaining, whether you like it or not. It's construed that way by a lot of people, like driving a car in a circle is considered endlessly entertaining to some people and endlessly boring to other people. But if enough people think it's entertaining, then advertisements, and then you get to present your product and offer it to the world. So it's actually part of the marketing
mm,
system. They're advertisers,
yeah.
they're entertainers, and they are selling advertising based.
And the fact that so often, once they retire, once they've
Yeah,
reached the ripe old age of 38 years old, then many of them go into full-time endorsements. Think about the Manning brothers. I mean, that
yeah,
is their
right.
career now. They're endorsing
Yeah. Although
every product under the sun.
it is 1 in 1,000. I've known any number of professional athletes. You've known coaches, I've known athletes, and none of them are now, and one of them won a significant award. And others are, player of the week, but had to retire after injuries after 4 years, things like that nature. They're good players. They made it to some degree, but none of them are selling. You got to hit big time. So, they work hard. I don't want to trash them, although it does make you laugh to consider who gets paid what in America.
So, do you see any significance in the distinction between work that serves to address or undo the consequences of sin, like medicine, counseling, auto
Yeah.
repair, physical therapy, and then lines of work which don't do that necessarily, like art, music, as we've been talking about, athletics, construction, where you could
Mm.
you can imagine or maybe expect that that kind of work will continue into the eschaton, even when
Mhm.
everything's fully redeemed and there is no sin. Do you see any significance to that distinction?
I think it's a very interesting one, and when I teach about it, I certainly spend a little bit of time with students or with listeners saying there's basically two kinds of work. There's restorative work and intrinsically valuable work. Um, the distinction isn't quite as hard as we might ask. You posed the question about the second law of thermodynamics. Would auto repair have occurred without the fall? Maybe. I mean, would tires have lasted forever if they would last forever? Wouldn't that mean there was no friction? Don't we need friction to
Mm,
walk as well as as well as run and drive a car? I mean, friction's the way we get around the world. The way anybody moves anywhere requires friction. So, um, auto repair might have been around regardless. I certainly don't want to say that work that's merely restorative is bad or deficient. I mean, Jesus was above all restorative, right? So, I mean, he was a carpenter, yes, but he was the one who came to give his life as a ransom for many because many were enslaved. And so to sin and death. And therefore, he was doing reparative, restorative, healing work, and we're glad of it. The There's a certain degree of pleasure, I would say, in doing work that is manifestly meeting basic human needs like food, clothing, shelter, childcare, teaching. I think teaching would have occurred. There'd be teachers of, music and the arts and geography. Who knows what we would have had? Maybe physics as well. Medical care, is certainly restorative. Boy, I'm sure disinterested in devaluing medical care or counseling care.
mhm.
So it's interesting, but not all that important,
Yeah,
in my view.
yeah. No, I think I share that intuition, and it certainly motivates deep thinking about the eschaton and the redemption of all things, um, and could be useful in response to somebody who maybe looks down on the arts. Say someone who's really strongly sort of STEM oriented in their
Yeah.
disposition, then you artists or music people, yeah, I guess there's a place for it, but it's not as important as what we do as scientists, just to have a ready retort. Well, but as even as a surgeon, will what will you do in the next world?
All right.
Um, that we know there will be. I'm quite confident there will be artists and there will be plenty of music, maybe more than we can imagine. Um, and maybe it'll take more prominent place for all we know. So we know there will be adjustments in terms of our
Yeah.
value
Right.
system. Who knows? Maybe that's one of them.
Yeah. There may be preachers in the eschaton,
Mm,
but there won't be evangelists.
mhm. That's
And
right.
I love to ask students sometimes, hey, what jobs will disappear? And of course, surgeon, oncologist, things like that disappear. Prison guard, yep. Criminal defense attorneys, prosecutors, no, but there could be lawyers. I mean, you might need laws when you have lots and
Mm,
lots of people near to regulate behavior. Nobody would fight about it. How
yeah.
about police? How about policemen in the new creation? I say there could be a few, like traffic cop.
Uh-huh.
They do good service to help people get in and out of a big event
But
safely.
how about this? And we all long for this. No more locks or passwords.
Yeah, that's for sure. I love that one. No, yeah, no IT theft prevention, folks. But hey, you know what? Let's give a shout out for the armed services in peaceable countries because in a world of military predation, strong armed forces prevent people from attacking peaceful people, right?
Mhm.
So it's a negative to a positive end. And a lot of the work that's a consequence of the fall is of that character.
Mm.
It preserves something, prevents evil, thwarts evil, cuts back on evil, which certainly doesn't mean it's evil or unimportant in itself, right?
Yeah. So what do you say to the person who feels a sense of vanity in their work and that say that for all the the labor that they're doing, they're just not accomplishing much, or that their work, though providing a genuine service, is not really that important in the long run, and they feel depressed by that.
Yeah. So if you're depressed, the first thing I want to say to anybody who's out there who's depressed is get outside more, walk around with the sun shining, walk around in nature, look at the trees. That's the best cure for depression. One of the other good cures is having a job you think matters. So let's just say a couple things. First of all, you and I are both, your very question implies that we agree that we're not just in favor of cheerleading. Your work matters. Hooray, hooray. Your work, no, some work doesn't matter. And sometimes people think their work doesn't matter because it doesn't matter. They're advertising garbage
Mm.
and they know it's garbage.
Mm.
Or they're selling, I don't know, they're changing the colors on Skittles a little bit so they'll catch the eye of a child a little more.
Mm.
Or they're tweaking the recipe for artificial blueberry smell so that you can pump it out and people will buy more of your blueberry muffins. That might be worth a little something if the muffins are good. So, but some work is pretty low importance. Selling cotton candy at the ball game, low. You might be frustrated by that. So my first word for somebody who thinks their work is meaningless would be this. Go ask a few people. If you're a Christian, ask your pastors and Christian friends if this work seems worthless or if it is worthless. So if you're marketing low-cost beer, cheap beer that's basically created to help drunks get drunk, then your work is meaningless. And if a couple of people tell you that, get out of there. Do something else. Market something you care about. But sometimes we're wrong. And a signal event in my interest in work was a man who was just desperate about the meaninglessness of his work, so he thought, driving a bread truck. And I thought, I'd never heard the question. I was pretty young, but I was speaking at a conference. And I thought, oh my goodness, people need bread. I asked him quickly what kind of bread he made. It was a good bread, whole bread, nutritious. And I said, we agree people need bread to eat, right? Right. Yep. Well, I mean, it's got to get to people's doorstep somehow. The way we do it in America is by a distribution system. You're part of that. And I think that it helped him. He had to think it through. It's not like the light came on, he was joyful 5 minutes later. But I would say he was wrong, that his work is not meaningless. Or the person who processes loans and they say, well, I just crunch numbers. Well, just crunching numbers, you still have to use some judgment. And lots of I just jobs actually have hidden value.
Mm.
You just don't see it because you're bored or it got repetitive. You have a bad boss. So ask, first of all, is your work really meaningless? And if it is, get another job. And if it isn't, then search out the question, how can I make it more meaningful? See its value and use my agency, whatever amount I have of agency, to make the place a little bit better. Car repair, you said earlier. You may say, all I'm doing is replacing brakes. Yeah, but brakes are important for cars. You need them. Makes everybody safe. Way to go, buddy.
You're saving lives.
Right.
Big stuff. Yeah, I think the first order of business, we would agree on this, is if anybody has any doubts, just reflect on the nature of your work. I mean, that would be
Right.
sort of if there's one thing that people should be taking away from your podcast or mine is, how should I think Christianly about what I do? And maybe that would prompt a move. And you say, yeah, this is not really serving people in a way that's significant. Maybe I should look for another line of work. I had a student who was a recent graduate at the time at university where I used to teach. And he called me one day. He said, Dr. Spiegel, I want to run something by you. It regards a potential career choice. I said, okay, great. He's a very talented young man. His name is Chris. I said, well, okay, what's on your mind? He says, well, you didn't know this about me, but I'm an extremely good poker player.
I've had this conversation too.
And
Yeah.
he says, I have become aware of the fact that I could actually make a living at this in different forums and with competitive poker. And he was recently married. I could support my wife and me and any kids we might have. What do you think of that as a career? And I just asked, I went Socratic on him, as I'm sure you do, with a lot of these questions. I said, well, Chris, ask yourself this. who am I serving
Mhm.
by this work? And isn't the biblical ideal that we should be making the world a better place in 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 the sense of serving, helping other people? How is my work helping other people? And I just know this, when I get to the other side, I wanna stand before Jesus and know that I served other people for decades or as long as I was able. I helped other people or I did my best. Ask
Mhm.
yourself, if you're just playing poker and making money that way, who are you helping? And I I just posed that question to him, and, in an email a few days later, maybe it was a few weeks later, he responded, he said, "Yeah, I'm gonna be doing something else," and I said, "Hey, you play poker on the side,
Yeah.
and within, legal and moral parameters, but you got profound gifts." I think he went on to grad school, and, I'm sure he's done very good, productive, service-oriented work. So you've had that conversation with others?
I've had the exact same conversation, and more than once, unfortunately, and with mixed results on one occasion, I'm gonna go promote the state lottery, and I said, that's a regressive tax on the poor who think they're gonna hit it rich, and, "Oh, well, but we're promoting education." I said, "Well, is it really helping? Is it net so it's you say you're helping the poor, are you? Would look into the question, who buys the lottery ticket before you give yourself to this?" That's one, and he's did it for a number of years despite my counsel. I wasn't his pastor, I was on a sports team with him, and so I didn't have much authority. But another person said, "Yeah, I see it. All I'm really doing is taking money away from people. I'm not serving them. I'm exploiting their weaknesses."
Mm.
So we agree on that.
What would you say, or what is your sense of the prevailing view of work in our country today?
Yeah, that's an important question. I'm gonna be real quick with this, okay? There are 3 views, and then we can explore it if you want to. Number 1, make as much as you can as fast as you can, get some rare skill or do some work that most people don't like to do, and stop as early as you can. Retire at 50. That's one. Another view, work like a madman till you're 50 and then enjoy the next 30 years or whatever, or a mad woman. Number 2 is, very common today among a certain age group, and that is, I want a job that requires me to work 35 or 40 hours at the most. I want to earn enough. I do not want to work overtime. I do not want to even really work 40 hours a week if I can help it. I want to get a skill that gives me enough money that I can enjoy the weekends. I can go skiing or kayaking or hiking or ballooning or whatever it is I want to do. Um, I live a relatively modest life. I don't need a big house. I don't need a fancy car. I just don't want to work that hard. So somebody epitomized it this way: the person who is happier you is probably doing less than you.
Mm.
So don't work so hard. That's number 2. The third one is, yeah, we heard 100 times that being an artist or a musician or pursuing your dreams is the way to poverty. I don't care. I'm willing to pursue the path to poverty. I'm not giving up on the goal of self-actualization, self-realization, self-expression. That's not a very big group right now. It used to be bigger than it is. So those are the big 3 among secular people. I think among Christians, we're still asking questions like, what did God give me the ability to do? Or what skill set did God give me that can be formed so it's beneficial to my neighbors and possibly even in some way transformative, at least for my corner of the world. Not many people say I'm going to change the world, but a lot of people are still very positive about the idea of changing my neighborhood or changing my work team of 5 or 10 people. So that's profoundly commendable in my view.
Mm. Yeah, I've run into those first 2 far more than that latter one, though I think maybe there's a Christian version of that, that I think that I held when I was a graduate student working on my PhD in philosophy, and I'd been told, "Look, there are 3 or 4 PhDs for every job, you'll never get
Right.
hired," and I just said, basically, "Darn the torpedo. I I am gonna do this thing," and,
Fiddlesticks on the torpedo.
heck yeah, and then, um, I I said, "Even if I don't get a job, I'll, in the academy, that is, I'll dig ditches, I'll collect trash. I want to learn about the history of ideas. I think I knew I was answering a kind of sense of a call to be a writer. And
Yeah.
you're a writer, you know how that is. Um, and I wanted to be involved in the great conversation, right? Because
Mm.
you can't be a great writer if you're not engaged in the big ideas.
Yep.
And so, but that kind of transcended employment for me. But God had this in mind, and against all odds, he brought me, these academic positions, and so, notwithstanding that attitude, which I do think was a position of faith, because I was answering what or acting on what I did sense was God's call on my life.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people do that, don't they? Certainly anybody gets a PhD in anything but the hard sciences or math, so forth, is doing so as a matter of faith, knowing that you very well won't use your training in a directly remunerative way.
So regarding calling, it is common to talk about a sense of calling in one's
Right.
work. Maybe you would talk about how maybe you have a story of the sense of God's call in your life to do the work you've done in ministry and in the academy. What is a Christian or biblical view of calling? And then what can one do to be sensitive to that call of God on their life?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So, first of all, when the Bible speaks about calling, it predominantly speaks of a call to Christ. That is, hearing the call to believe. If you just look up the word call in the Bible, we're called to Christ, called to holiness, called to respond to God. That's by far number one in terms of the use of the word calling. The concept of calling is a little broader. And so we have people summoned by God to do things like Moses deliver the people from Egypt. The word call isn't there, but it's clearly his calling. David called to be a king. Joseph called to work for a Pharaoh to preserve many lives, etc. You can Solomon called in measure to Paul called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. So the word call isn't there very much. So we don't distinguish between word and concept. So the word and the concept are not together very much in the Bible, really only in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, remain in the position you're in when you were called,
Mm.
which implies that your position as Jew or Gentile, slave or free is a part of your calling. And so then that teaches us that calling is not simply to a job, but it's also to a place and also to a group of people in that place. And locatedness is vital. So at one point, I was offered a job in another city. It was a very interesting job, leadership position. And I turned it down. And my wife and I were going for a walk, and we stopped and turned and looked at each other simultaneously and said the exact same words, "I think we're supposed to stay in St. Louis." And I
Mhm.
think that's part of my call in life is to be in St. Louis for whatever reason. I mean, I could give you all kinds of reasons. You don't want my life story right now. But so call to a place counts. Then with regard to your particular calling in life, I would say we have a rough sense of what we're supposed to do with ourselves based on what we're good at and what we like when we're young, maybe children, or even you sense it sometimes when you're 10 or 15. You get a little better sense as time goes by. But one of my favorite books by Mr. Epstein called Range explains about 6 years old now, explains how many people found their perfect spot by leaving their spot for a while and going to a cognate or adjacent field, and other skills that they had not perceived in themselves emerged. Or a person at work who's not quite sure they're in the right place. I always say, volunteer. If you're not sure you're in the right place, stay in your job, but volunteer to do something a little different. Don't ask to be relieved of a burden. Just do something else. Say, hey, boss, what else do you have for me?
Mm.
And a lot of people discover their true calling in life in this iterative process that goes on for the next 10 or 15 years after you finish college. Certainly, I'm going to guess you and I both found that we had skills that we didn't see in ourselves that emerged somewhere around the age of 35 or 40 or 43
Sure.
because we just did stuff and people said, oh, you're good at this. And you thought, am I? Oh, yeah, maybe I am. And then you end up doing it for 15 years.
Yeah, that's sort of the happy side of the fact about human nature that sometimes that a person is the last to find out something significant about themselves, right? Our wives, they know our vices long before we do, right? But they also know our gift set, maybe at least aspects to it that we're not aware of, and that's the beauty of Christian community and family, and people will point things out to you, and you say, "Wow, yeah, I guess I am good at that." Now I see that now that I'm 40, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a grandfather now, and I'm pretty good with my grandkids. I help some of them. They kinda gravitate toward me sometimes when they're in a little bit of stress or feeling lonely. I mean, who would have thought that? But there it is. Another way to put it is all leaders are talent scouts, right? And if the leader is a good person, good man or good woman, seeking not only their own cause, but the good of the people who work for them. That is to say, they're not gonna recruit people to a job that will crush them just to meet their need, right? So a good talent scout who knows somebody is always looking and assessing, "Hmm, this young man, this young woman could be good at this. I'm gonna give them a chance." Hey, I'm gonna take a tiny break here, close my door. I don't know if you can hear it, but my wife is a piano teacher.
Oh, good, yeah. I heard some hymns being played. No, it was some Christmas carols. So, as I was looking to go into philosophy, to get a PhD and to teach, and I would sometimes mention that I sensed a call, and now in retrospect, it's even clearer to me, for a variety of reasons, God was calling me into this. Well, you probably know well that, the guild, philosophy, not exactly friendly to theism, much less Christianity. In fact, there's a certain hostility there, and
Mm,
where I did my PhD, there were certainly no Christians. I think I didn't find out there was a theist until the day I defended my dissertation, and
mm,
one of my readers he was a longtime Marxist, and this was in the early '90s, and with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, there were a lot of Marxists, felt kinda disillusioned, and he had announced to me, as we were walking back to our cars, he said, "Yeah, I think at this point in my life, I'd call myself a theist," and I just wanted to hug him, it's so rare. Turned out his wife had been running a Bible study in the neighborhood. She was an evangelical Christian. I'm sure she'd been praying for him. He's a dear, dear guy. I mean, there were a lot of profs in that department that I dearly love. They're just really sweet, kind folks. Kind of in spite of themselves,
mhm.
they had these virtues, that were very Judeo-Christian. Um, but still, the overall, and to this day, wow, there is a sense in which you're being thrown to the wolves.
Yeah.
So some would be suspicious, skeptical about the idea of being called
Mm,
into that field, or to say certain fields in the business world, or to particular organization, say
mhm.
that prizes values that are antithetical to biblical values. Do you think it's possible to, notwithstanding all that, to get a call to go into such environments? And how should one go about deciding whether to accept an offer to work in such a setting?
Yeah, important question. So there's no question at all, in my opinion, that it's right to head into settings where you're in a anti-Christian or hostile environment. Now we see this in places in the Bible. Joseph worked for Pharaoh, who was, under delusions of grandeur. David worked for Saul, who was self-aggrandizing, violent, fitful. The biggest one, of course, is that Obadiah, not the prophet, but another Obadiah worked for Ahab. And um, at the time that Elijah was calling down judgment, he was working for Ahab. They met, in Kings.
Right.
So he clearly was there. We don't know, was he converted while he was there? Was his father in that role? We don't know how he came to do that, but he was saving the lives of the prophets whom Ahab and Jezebel certainly would have killed if they could have. So the question then becomes, can you do good in that spot? And good is not just providing for a family, but, if you say Joseph saving lives in a famine, but rightly staying in that position, but Moses not staying because the Pharaoh he could have worked for was genocidal and he couldn't have supported that, right? So it depends on whether you're able to do good or not. I'd like to point out that Elijah and Obadiah met each other. Neither one said the other was wrong. Obadiah didn't say, Elijah, stop complaining and criticizing. Just get in on the inside and reshape it from the inside. Be transformative within. He didn't say that. Nor did Elijah say, Obadiah, what are you doing working for that murderer? They respected each other, right? So we have different callings. I wouldn't call him a friend, but I had a long conversation with a man who worked for Disney Corporation. He was high up. He directed the first Mulan movie, which made about $500 million about 20 years ago. And there were a fair number of Christians, but Disney at the time was unabashedly hostile to Christianity. And they had he eventually left. He said, I can't use my creative powers. I've got to leave and go independent. But his friend said, if you leave, you're one of the most powerful people here. If you leave, what's going to happen to the leaven that occurs? So people say, how can any Christian work in the military? Well, the answer is you can work in a good military that's trying to preserve peace. And I think we all would have been glad if some of the Christians who were working in Germany in the 40s had succeeded in getting rid of Hitler instead of coming close and failing and paying for it with their lives. So I certainly think we should ask the question, am I able to do good in this place, restrain evil, present at least Christian morals, or remind people if you're in the entertainment industry, hey, there are Christians watching, if you're at Netflix, for example, which is, really fond of creating programming that has blasphemy as a routine feature of dialogue. Can you cut it down? Can you point out, hey, we got 30 million Christian viewers, so why don't we cut down on the blasphemy? If, on the other hand, you're forced, we might say, to write scripts and you keep hearing from the boss, we need more blasphemy, you probably have to leave. So I wouldn't say probably have to leave. You definitely have to leave or asked to work on children's programming or something. So the question is, can I work in a setting hostile to God? Undoubtedly, the answer is yes. If you can restrain evil, bring some gospel light to the place, by which I do not simply mean sharing the faith evangelistically with the people next door to you. I mean also the leavening influence of the gospel. And if you can't, then get out of there.
Yeah, that's good. Well, switching gears a little bit, complementing our business on earth, doing so much work, so much of the week is dedicated to that. There is rest and relaxation and recreation. What would you say is the proper place of recreation in the Christian life? And how does a person know when they've achieved a reasonable balance?
The reasonable balance is made very clear to us, fortunately, by Scripture. 6 days you shall labor, and then a day of rest. Now, that doesn't mean you work all day, every day. And it certainly doesn't mean you should be employed 6 days. You can be employed 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, depending on the nature of your job, because work is more than employment. So we need to have definite, sustained periods of rest. That's very clear. I think you and I probably both read quite a few biographies. And one of the things you notice if you look at highly productive people is that they go on sort of rampages of work, and they just, write whole books. And hey, Heidegger, what was Heidegger's book he wrote in 6 weeks? I don't know.
Being in Time?
Being in Time. I think he wrote it in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And of course he had to fix it up. But, and then after that enormous push, they collapse and they call themselves lazy. We're not machines, right? So you need rest. I don't know about you, but my story certainly is one where I'm very prone to work too hard and kind of assume that work is essential to get done what needs to be done. I better do it because nobody else is doing it. Work too hard. And so I try to make sure I take a walk outside every day of some length. And maybe I'll do it with one of my daughters lives right up the street, or my wife, or I may walk and talk on the phone, or I may walk and pray or think about a problem at some length. And I played tennis. I played basketball for years and years, including on the courts of Geneva College for a number of years, both as an undergrad and then teaching for a while. Loved the game of basketball and other sports. And I love to hang out with children, my children, and then my grandchildren. And I partly spend a lot of time with them, so I'm not working all the time. And because I'm trying to fight my own propensity to be a workaholic and the to exaggerate my importance in
Mhm.
weaker moments. So a day of rest helps with that.
It can take a lot of work to fight the impulse to constantly work,
Work.
right?
Yeah. A lot of effort. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. A lot of
yeah.
mental effort. Yeah.
So, you strike me as a shooting guard. Was that your position or
I was one of those people who could play any position. I've shrunk as I get older. I was 6'1", so in a pickup game, I could play point. I like point guard, or I love to rebound. I really love
Huh,
rebounding. So if I'd been a little taller, I would have been a very happy forward.
huh. That yeah, rebounding, I tell you, there are times where I'm tempted to call it a spiritual gift. I mean, it's that significant, and it doesn't get the attention that, a number of other basketball skills do, but
Hey, I love to watch a ball in the air and go, "I know where it's going,"
yeah, wow.
and get an offensive rebound. Like, how did that ball land in his hands? Because I was watching the art
Yeah.
of the
You
ball.
might not be a studied physicist, but there's a kind of intuitive, sense of physics there that involves and
So all sports involve instantaneous assessments of
mm,
questions like, "Where will this ball land?"
yeah.
And how can I get in position to be where the ball is going to land?
There's an essay, how all athletes are intuitive physicists, but,
Well, if you watch an outfielder, professional outfielder, the ball game, and watch them go after a ball, and the good ones land at the right spot, when they're going full out, they get to the spot at the exact perfect instant. Not a tenth of a second too early, not a tenth of a second
mm,
too late. It's a marvel to behold.
yeah, risking their health in the process
That's true.
for the sake of the team, really.
Yeah.
Final question, we close all our interviews with this question, which more or less relates to whatever the guest's, special competencies or expertises are. And I think it's especially apropos here, and that is a question about the meaning of life. Um, what is your view of the meaning of life, and how has your professional work aimed to work that out, to work out that conviction in practice?
I'm gonna give you a disappointing answer. You ready? I don't
Okay.
really know. I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know. I can give you the right answer. The right answer is the purpose of life is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. I can guess at the meaning of life. The meaning of life is to know the Lord and to live faithfully for Him in the body with the spouse, in my case, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, my sons-in-law, my friends, my coworkers, to live life in a way that lets me enjoy them and love them and serve them according to the gifts and abilities and opportunities the Lord's laid in front of me. And I think certainly I have less of my life ahead of me than behind me. And I look back and I think, how on earth did I get all these opportunities? How did I get these skills? What blessings have been poured on
Mm.
me? How can I make sure that I'm not just consuming them, but sharing them and, if possible, multiplying them? Of course, I do that as a teacher above all, and a preacher and an evangelist. I'm not, an overt evangelist, but it's fun. It's just funny to me. People walk up to me every once in a while and say, "Hey, I just want you to know that I trusted Jesus while you were preaching last month. Just thought you'd like to know that." I go, "Great. What did I say? What happened?" It is often the most ordinary point imaginable that the Holy Spirit somehow used, but it hit them. That wasn't even the point of the sermon. That was just a setup for the main point. Well, for me, it was the main point. They say so. Just serve faithfully and see how God chooses to use it.
So I haven't known you long, but already I can say there's several people who've told me you were one of their favorite professors or favorite teachers ever, um, at Covenant and in whatever other context they've learned under you. So you are impacting a lot of souls and what my life, uh, I've boiled down my life mission to 2 words. I can sum it up 2 words, and maybe you'd identify with this, and that is to fortify soul.
Oh, I
Yeah,
like it.
I want everything I do, whether I'm a parent, teacher, friend, husband, whatever, everything I do, I want it to serve that mission to fortify souls. And that implies a certain balance, right? None of us who are writers can write all the books or articles we'd like to. We need to scale back, make sure we're not compromising time with our wife, kids.
Right.
And I believe that's one of the things that on Judgment Day, I'm not going to regret, right? Is the time I've spent with the people I love and helping people and nurturing souls, fortifying souls, that and being unqualified in my forgiveness. There's actually a debate about this, whether we really should be totally categorical in forgiving. There's kind of I hope it's a minority report in the Christian theological world that says, well, no, you can withhold forgiveness until somebody apologizes. And that's not my view. I've prayed the Lord's Prayer too many times. I don't want God to be holding back forgiveness of certain sins that I've yet to confess, right? But so I am all out with that, and all out and all in with fortifying souls so far as I can manage. And sounds like that's your view as well.
I love that answer. I mean, I might even I might have to change it a little so I can make it mine, but 2 words, that's a fantastic answer. Can I just comment on forgiveness? I know this is kind of off.
Yeah, please.
I think it's helpful, to distinguish between the 2 forms of forgiveness. There's the unconditional, absolute Christ-like forgiveness, which we certainly owe to everybody because we don't wish God's judgment or wish doom or endless pain or an inability on their part to repent. We wish the best for them. So we always forgive everyone from our heart. But I don't have the texts in front of me here, but, there are places in the Bible you can appeal to that seem to indicate that you don't, if they don't, there's a time when you do forgive and a time when you don't. You don't when somebody doesn't repent. So if someone's sins are forgiven, if you forgive someone their sins, they're forgiven. So what that means is the absolute in the heart, I always forgive everybody, but transactionally, if someone, let's say I'm a pastor and someone seriously wrongs a child in my church, I don't let it go. I don't say, oh, let's just forgive them, meaning I'll let it go. We will not let this go until this person, I'm not talking about the legal side, if it's a crime that's been committed. Let's say it's not. They're just cruel to a child. We're not going to let this go until this person recognizes what they did. Because for their soul and the soul of the child, it's important to not simply say, oh, let's just forgive him. You need to understand that you crushed this child, and it's terribly wrong to do so. You need to not do that. Or you crushed this woman or this man. We're not going to let it go. So there's the absolute sense, the Christ-like redemptive sense, and there's the doing justice in this world sense, which we might say has a transactional element. I forgive you when you recognize you did wrong. That's probably why there's a disagreement, because there's a failure to make a distinction. You, philosopher, we love making distinctions.
Yeah, that is really
Right.
good. And I was speaking of it in the first sense.
Yeah.
The second sense is clear from the Pauline literature and elsewhere. He's pro excommunication, and that can be a very gracious thing to do to someone that you have forgiven, but as an act of grace now excommunicate. And then he says in one case he's delivered someone over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme.
Right.
Presumably there is that personal forgiveness, but that discipline, which the church has failed in many ways in our time to be serious about that kind of church discipline, when it turns out to be a very gracious thing and is consistent with personal forgiveness.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, and this has been wonderful. I've enjoyed our conversation. I'm sure our listeners will benefit from this.
Well, Jim, it's been a pleasure to get to know you a little better by having this conversation now. Thanks for your great questions, and may the Lord bless this podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. To get notified when we publish a new episode, please subscribe, and let us know what you think by leaving us a review.